We are indeed deeply blessed. The great author, Elie Wiesel, whose account of the treatment he and his family received at the hands of the Nazis was captured in the book Night, reaches into that ungraspable reality of the Holocaust. I reread that book this week. I believe that perhaps I will reread that book each Yom HaShoah in the future. He said this in his Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech: "I remember. It happened yesterday or eternities ago. A young Jewish boy discovered the kingdom of night. I remember his bewilderment. I remember his anguish. It all happened so fast. The ghetto, the deportation, the sealed cattle car. The fiery altar upon which the history of our people and the future of mankind were meant to be sacrificed. I remember." He asked his father, "Can this be true? This is the 20th century, not the Middle Ages. Who would allow such crimes to be committed? How could the world remain silent?" And now, the boy is turning to me. "Tell me," he asks, "what have you done with my future? What have you done with your life?" And I tell him that I have tried to keep memory alive, that I have tried to fight those who would forget, because if we forget, we are guilty, we are accomplices. And then I explained to him how naive we were, that the world did know and remained silent. And that is why I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, not the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men or women or any people are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must be, at that moment, the center of the universe. And in these words, Wiesel calls upon us to understand the quickness with which the world of his family changed. Just as Andy's words, just as Liesel's words helped us to grasp, part of the horror of the Holocaust was that it happened really very quickly. And also that it occurred in the context of just regular life, through the daily actions of ordinary people, what Hannah Arendt has famously called the banality of evil. While we can find comfort in thinking of Adolf Hitler as extraordinary, a force of supernatural evil, those who would study this and who have studied this more and more over the years would say that this is a false comfort. Raul Hilberg, himself a refugee from Nazism and a leading Holocaust scholar, says this: "An expanding body of research documents the role that ordinary people in Nazi Germany and Europe played in the Holocaust. Examples of divergent behaviors in similar contexts show that more latitude for individual discretion existed than is often recognized." This was true, he writes, even in Nazi society, where the ruling regime's vision of a collective, biologically homogeneous national community resulted not only in the persecution of the Jews and other groups like the Roma, people with disabilities, gays, but more generally in the radical devaluation and suppression of individual rights and freedoms. And he goes on, People had choices. Many individuals actively participated in the stigmatization, isolation, impoverishment, and violence culminating in the mass murder of 6 million European Jews. Many others supported the participants from the sidelines, tolerated their actions, or benefited from them. And still others disapproved of what they witnessed and were silent. Some publicly spoke out, and others helped the victims in lesser or greater ways. These are hard words to hear, and I understand that. But those who have looked into the history of these unspeakable, unimaginable events suggest to us that we must hear and remember. 6 million Jewish people, and then again as many others who were killed through the Nazi regime, particularly in Russia, were not killed by one man alone. Each year, Yom HaShoah asks us to hold these untenable truths. And we should remember this, because the loss of so many precious and irreplaceable lives is something that must live on in honor of their past and in protection of our future. In our faith, we are compelled not to focus on Adolf Hitler and grant him some other being status of extreme devil-given flesh. And yet we do this because it is more frightening to allow ourselves to comprehend that he may have been just an extremely wounded person who rose to power in a wounded and divided nation. For if we can hold that, then we truly know that it can happen again, and history has shown it has happened again in many other countries, in many other parts of the world. My colleague Paul Razor says, evil is the ability of the dominant worldview to make itself seem logical and even necessary. To fight this kind of evil, he says, we need an inner transformation, not just a purifying of our hearts. He says it's a matter of coming to have a totally different kind of perception, the kind of transformation that will allow us to perceive things as a total shift in our worldview, something that allows us to move forward together and to actively resist. Social analysis by itself will not give us this. In fact, most of our social analysis, he says, is done from the perspective of the dominant worldview. Much of our political, social justice work makes only a statement that is about politics. It's not a faith statement. It can speak only to the mind, and it seeks the mind's response. But when we deal with evils at this scale, we must incorporate a spiritual aspect, because we are making a faith claim, and what we need is a spiritual response. Part of that spiritual response is to be the holder of memory and hope. The hope that comes because we do not look away, we do not treat these times as business as usual. Not in this year, not so soon after the summer and fall of 2015, when the migrant crisis in Europe caught the attention of those who will never forget. Robert Frolick, who was the chief rabbi of Hungary, said this: "It was horrifying when I saw those images of the police writing numbers on people's arms. It reminded me of Auschwitz. And then they put people on a train with armed guards to take them to a camp where they are closed in. Of course," he says, "of course there are echoes of the Holocaust." And here within our own nation, the hatred-spiked rhetoric of a few of our leaders is of less concern than the apathy and even support that these words have generated among large numbers of our fellow citizens. Last election, 4 years ago, a candidate who called people out with the kind of remarks that are being made would have lost their candidacy. They would have been discredited for making remarks that were so laden with hate. But now there is a kind of "you can't make me" taunt. And a lot of the response seems to indicate that that is true. What we are seeing is a kind of baiting that is being wrapped around blatant racism, Islamophobia, and an unabashed ethic of white supremacy. We need to remember today and in the months to come that in 1924, the Nazi Party won 3% of the election and was thought of as a non-entity. In 1933, they won 30% of the vote, and with that, Adolf Hitler took the lead. We need to remember. We must not be sucked into the banality, into the complacity, into complicity with evil by failing to see it, by failing to look directly at it, and by failing to respond. We have a choice. It begins with remembering. We cannot look away, and we need to remember that part of what we celebrate in joining with communities around the world this week is not just the atrocities, it is the heroic resilience of the human spirit.